photos that were shot so far, we've seen that there were photos in all the events, including the social dinner, are available. We made a Flickr account. You can go directly to that by clicking on the website. On the home, there is a link to that. So if you want to see yourself, getting some booze or something, or whatever, in any action, talking, you can already do that. And of course, we put the rest of the pictures, as soon as possible. So you already find it there. Second thing, some people ask for certificates of attendance, because I know there could be issues for reimbursements and something. We already gave the certificates to those who require them. In case there is somebody else that needs the certificate, please let us know so that we can just print them out, sign them, and just give them to you right away instead of sending them to wherever you live afterwards. Last announcement is about today's parallel sessions. I don't know if you know this in the program. Of course, there are going to be parallel sessions this afternoon, you know that. But before the coffee breaks, so right after lunch, there are going to be only 4 parallel sessions, which are going to be all here in the Congress wing, in the same rooms that you already know. Whereas after the coffee break, there's going to be a 5th parallel session on top of that, which is not in Terrasol, because that was already occupied when we made the reservation and decided to have a 5th session. But it's going to be in Veranda, which is actually underneath Terrasol. And of course, we'll put signs. There will be people there indicating. So most of you know where Terrasol is on the other side, in the other side of the building. So the floor where the reception is. So 2 floors down, and then you go all the way to the corridor towards the end, and then 1 more floor down. But we'll try to show you the way, just to prepare yourself, because of course, the model is going to be slightly different today. Okay, with that, I can leave it to Michael for the scientific part.
Good morning, everyone. So it's my real pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning. The modal employer of students in my lab is actually not a university, it's a company. And when I ask students, why do you want to go there, either for a job after a PhD or for an internship, they all give 2 answers. And the first answer is that hey, it's an opportunity to work with detailed records about 1.5 billion people around the world. But that's actually the secondary reason. The primary reason they give is our next speaker, Lada Adamic.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's been a very, very, very engaging conference so far. Today I wanted to talk about a paper that Eitan Bakshi, Solomon Messing, and I recently published in Science. They were the lead authors, but I'm going to talk about it here. And it's going to be US-centric, so I apologize for that in advance. So recently, a Pew study found that a majority of millennials actually get their news about politics and government from Facebook. This is also true, or it's half of Generation X folks do as well. So it's more important than ever to understand what this means for people receiving news, reading news through online social networks, because that is where they're turning to news for now. And the danger that Eli Pariser has eloquently formulated in his book, The Filter Bubble, is that perhaps because there's homophily in social networks and we're surrounded by our friends when we're online, there's the potential to create echo chambers where we hear just like-minded opinions. Or perhaps the algorithms that work very hard to deliver the most engaging content to us would somehow not show us challenging or interesting cross-cutting content. So several of us at Facebook wanted to study this, thinking that it was important, because Facebook in general thinks it's important to study how people engage with Facebook. And we also wanted to engage with the scientific community, and that's why we published. And all 3 of us were studying online political discourse prior to this study. And when we did the study, we didn't have anything special to prove. We just had a genuine curiosity and interest in finding out what the landscape looks like and publishing that. So, as I mentioned previously, we studied political interaction online. So now 10 years ago, I was studying online discourse between political blogs. And there, that's the image on the left, you find that liberal blogs primarily were linking to other liberal blogs, and conservative blogs were linking primarily to other conservative blogs, with about 10% of interaction in between. Michael Conover and Phil Menser and others found something similar later for Twitter. However, when you think about these online social networks, here you're looking at accounts that are specialized in discussing politics, that are following other accounts that are specializing in discussing politics. On Facebook, however, there is some potential for greater diversity because we know the people we know from many different contexts, and a lot of them have nothing to do with politics. So this image here shows a social network of a conservative. So they're not shown, but these are the communities in their ego network. And red is conservative and blue is liberal. And so this is all anonymized, so I don't know who this is or who any of the friends are, but you can imagine having some sort of narrative. Maybe they grew up in a liberal family, but a conservative neighborhood and high school, then went to a liberal college, or maybe, I don't know, the Peace Corps or something, then later entered either through education or work got to know more conservative folks. But overall, they know both liberals and conservatives, and this is fairly typical. Another reason to be optimistic about the potential for diversity is that in a previous study, Eitan and I and others found that a lot of the information that we're exposed to and the information that we choose to reshare actually comes to us from our weak ties, as opposed to our strong ties. And our strong ties typically might have redundant information. So if my mom sends me a link about the economy in Croatia from The Economist, I can say, Mom, I saw that. I also read The Economist, and I also have an interest in Croatia. But if some of my friends who are in the audience here post a link to news coverage of some latest computational social science paper, there's a good chance that I didn't know about it already, and that I'll learn something new. And in general, the weak ties tend to outnumber the strong ties by a lot. I'm sure we'll hear about that a little bit later on. And so there is this potential for diversity. Finally, Solomon did the study as part of his PhD thesis, where they recruited subjects and they showed them the same article titles, but with different indicators. So here are the logos of the different news sources. So the folks who came in might already have a preference for Fox News or MSNBC. Or they might just get a social signal, how many people endorse this article. Or the two might be combined. And so in this first treatment, what they found was that people who leaned, say, conservative were more likely to select the Fox News article. But if the social signal was presented, that tendency was a bit diminished, right? So there's something about social signals perhaps diminishing this partisan affiliation preference. So there's some potential for diversity, but there's also a lot of potential for diminishing that diversity. And they come from various sources. So the first one I already mentioned is that because you're receiving this news through your friends, they're sharing the news and you see it in your Facebook news feed, if your friends are a lot like you, you might get very like-minded news. And so this would be the political echo chamber. The second factor is a combination of algorithmic ranking and the proportion of your news feed that you read. So in the extreme case, for example, if you're a conservative and all of the conservative content is ranked on top and you don't go very far down in your news feed, you might be entering a form of a filter bubble where you're not seeing the cross-cutting liberal content. And so the third potential factor is that even if you're presented with cross-cutting content, you may choose not to click on it. So all three factors is something that we were interested in, and they roughly break down into the potential news that you could see from your friends, the exposure that you actually get by reading your newsfeed, and then the articles that you select. So here's an illustration. You have, say, a conservative Facebook user, and they have three friends, a conservative, a moderate, and a liberal. And the conservative has shared a conservatively aligned article and a moderately aligned article. The moderate has shared a conservative one, and the liberal has shared a liberally aligned article. Now, this individual just reads part of their newsfeed, and they see the moderately aligned article, the conservative one, and the liberal one, and their proportion of cross-cutting content has changed from a third to a half, because they're two kind of aligned articles in here. But then they only opt to read the conservative and the moderate article, and so their amount of cross-cutting exposure in this toy example is 0 in the end. And then the question is, at each of these steps, is the exposure diverse? That is, are we all in one giant social network receiving diverse news? Or are we living in echo chambers where people of different political leanings are sharing distinct news with each other? So in order to answer this question, we analyzed de-identified data from 10.1 million active US users who self-reported their political affiliation. And in this data were also 7 million distinct URLs that were shared during a period of 6 months ending this past January. First, we had to do a little bit of groundwork. If you look at your Facebook profile, if you have an account, you can specify there your political views. So this is my profile. I'm very strongly anti-penny. But in general, you can put anything you like in there. And the demographics of people who report their political affiliation, about a quarter of the people do. You're most likely to if you're in the 25 to 44 age range, but it's pretty consistent across the age ranges, the proportion of people who do. Slightly more men than women report their political affiliation, which is consistent with the politics gap in the gender gap in US politics. And if you're logging in more often, meaning you're a more engaged Facebook user, you're more likely to specify your political affiliation. Now, most people don't put anti-penny, they put very sensible text for their political affiliation, but still it's not a drop-down menu that you pick from. So we need to map from the free text responses onto a scale, in this case from -2, which is very liberal, to +2, being very conservative. And we validated this with a survey of 50,000 individuals, showing that there was a correlation of 0.8 between their self-identified affiliation on this scale and what they had put in their Facebook profile. And there were, people like me who are not in the sample because what they specified did not fit on this scale. So just to reiterate, the population we studied were active Facebook users who'd logged in on average 4 out of 7 days each week and who had self-identified their political affiliation. There's more work to be done to study the same thing for people who did not do this. So the rest of the groundwork identifying the hard news. So hard news is news about politics and government, as opposed to soft news, which is things like lifestyle and sports and music and entertainment. And the way that we developed a classifier for hard versus soft news is, as the training set, we took all the URLs that had something obvious just in the URL itself. For example, polity or govern went to the hard news category, and things that had words like lifestyle or sports went to the soft news category. And then we used data from the URL characters, the title, and the little blurb, the summary of the article, to classify hard versus soft news with 97% accuracy. So we were pretty sure when someone was reading something about politics and government versus, for example, sports. And we, in the end, had about 200,000 URLs, which were shared by at least 20 people who had self-identified their political affiliation. The reason why we needed at least 20 is because we wanted to know the alignment of that article. Is it aligned with liberals or is it aligned with conservatives, depending on who's sharing it. So here are a few examples. So if 3 liberals, 1 moderate, and 1 conservative shared this particular article, then its alignment is -2/5, versus if it's exactly balanced, it's 0. If 2 conservatives and 1 moderate shared, then the alignment is +2/3. If you look at the distribution of shares of these articles for hard news, you see that they tend to be shared more if they're on the more extreme ends of the spectrum. So out here are Fox News and Breitbart, and down here are the New York Times and Huffington Post. This is in contrast to soft news, where the most shared get attention from both liberals and conservatives, which makes sense. We validated this measure with previous attempts to classify political alignment of news sources. Gensko and Shapiro they did a text analysis of articles in different news sources and looked at how well it aligned with what congressmen, Democrats and Republicans, had said in Congress. So it's a bit noisy, but you can see the general trend. Better alignment still was gotten with some crowdsourced labels of these different news sources. So now we have the ideological affiliation of a person is on Facebook, whether they're being exposed to cross-cutting content. So how much of the content is cross-cutting? Well, there are various factors, and factor 0 is not very realistic, but it's saying, what if you could view any content, if you were equally exposed to any content anywhere, shared anywhere on Facebook? And here you can see, so these are the links that were classified as liberal, neutral, and conservative, and you can see that this happened because they were shared primarily by conservatives or primarily by liberals. The neutral content, as we saw before, was shared less, and you also see what proportion of the content is shared by people who had self-identified versus people of unknown political affiliation. So you can see a bit more conservative than liberal content, which means that for random exposure, which does not happen, but it's interesting to think about, the liberals would be exposed to slightly more cross-cutting content than conservatives would. But as I said, what you're exposed to depends on what your friends are sharing, so it matters what your friends are. And on the top, you can see the distribution of friend political affiliation for liberals. And it's fairly typical to have 70 to 80% of your friends being liberal if you're a liberal, but also some fraction of your friends will be conservative or moderate. For moderates, the distributions are wider for how many conservatives and liberals you'll have in your network, but you'll also have slightly more other moderates in your network as well. And the conservative networks are a mirror image of the liberal ones. So here are just 3 example networks that are actually typical. They're in the typical range for each. So a liberal will have a lot of other liberals, but also some fraction of conservatives. This moderate tends to have a pretty balanced network, and this conservative has a large conservative cluster, but also 2 liberal clusters in their network. And lest you think that these were, chosen because they're extra pretty, which maybe they were, but they're pretty atypical. Here are randomly selected liberal networks. So you see some that have predominantly liberal networks, but also some liberals who have a predominantly conservative social network. Here are moderates, and here you have a mix. Some have very conservative networks, some have very liberal networks, some are in between. And finally, for conservatives, a lot of them have primarily conservative networks, but some have a significant fraction of liberals in their networks as well. So overall, people will tend to have, on average, more friends who share their political affiliation and ideology. And so when we look at the actual potential exposure from the network, it's not as diverse as random, but it's still relatively diverse. So for conservatives, it's about 35%. For liberals, it's about 23% cross-cutting content. Now, the second factor is this combination of having a ranked newsfeed and how much of your newsfeed you go through. So this is a schematic of exactly how the newsfeed algorithm works. And here are all the potential stories that your friends have shared, and then the black box happens, and then you get a ranked newsfeed where these stories occur in a given order. And now, if you only read part of your newsfeed, or you don't log in that often, or you don't scroll down, alignment may be different from what your friends have shared. So we found that this effect is relatively mild. So in each case, the proportion of cross-cutting content decreases a little bit, but it's really just a small effect, especially relative to the effect of what your friends are sharing. The final factor is just selection. So even if you're exposed to cross-cutting content, do you engage with it? Do you click through? Do you read it? And here we find a further decrease in cross-cutting content, but still for liberals it's about 20% cross-cutting, and for conservatives about 29% cross-cutting content that they actually click on. And these results are robust with respect to position effects. So your likelihood of clicking through, whether it's cross-cutting or congruent, kind of goes step in step with respect to the position of the story in your newsfeed. So here's another way of visualizing all the factors. We have for liberals and conservatives, you can imagine that these are all the stories that are shared by the person's friends, and then the ones that are seen in newsfeed are a little bit less diverse, and then the stories that are clicked on are a little bit less diverse still. But, just to point out that you're still getting cross-cutting exposure in both cases. And one final interesting thing is that if you have a weaker political affiliation, so you're liberal but not very liberal, or you're conservative but not very conservative, you get more cross-cutting exposure than if you're more, I guess, if your ideological affiliation is stronger. So to summarize, I'm just going to read through these stats. On average, so I showed you all the detailed distributions. Now we're talking on average, 23% of people's friends claim an opposing political ideology. Of the hard news content that people's friends share, about 30% of it cuts across ideological lines. When it comes to what people see in their news feed, about 29% of the hard news encountered cuts across ideological lines. And finally, 25% of the hard news content that people actually click on cuts across ideological lines. So one of the remaining questions, of course, is how do you evaluate this amount of cross-cutting exposure? Do you compare this to reading a single newspaper? For example, if you only read the New York Times, how does this compare? Or if you only watch one news program, if you only watch Fox News, likely the exposure here gives you more cross-cutting exposure. And another thing that I forgot to point out, but if you do have a Facebook account, I'd like you to look through your feed and just see the number of different news sources that you're exposed to. So I went through this exercise yesterday while preparing for this talk, and I saw, the first story was the New Yorker, the second one was Bloomberg, the third one was The Independent, a UK publication. The fourth one was the Bleacher Report. Now, I would never go to the Bleacher Report on my own because I'm not a big sports fan, but knowing that a friend really cared about some development in basketball, I didn't click on it, but at least I had been exposed to sports news, which could have diversified things for me. It's also not clear that we should necessarily aim for 50-50% exposure. It's not clear where this would happen. And it's also not clear how the diversity of exposure, for example, affects opinions, although there's a lot of nice research going on about that. So the data set is available, so the study's reproducible, thanks to Barbara for pushing on that and making sure it happened. So it's in the Facebook Dataverse repository. In there you can find measures of site-level alignment, so you get the scores for different news outlets, the scripts for classifying hard and soft content, or news articles, if you'd like to do that, and other replication materials that you'd need. So thanks. To learn more about research at Facebook or to read some of our fun blog posts, here are the links. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Maybe I missed something, but I have an impression that there might be some logical loop. Because so far as I understand, you define conservative content because it was shared by a conservative person. But there also, if I'm a conservative, I may share something that I don't agree with, and that I can comment negatively, and this will be sharing cross-cutting content, but this is sort of lost. And then you define conservative content through conservative users and conservative users through conservative content. So, but maybe I missed something. Please, could you elaborate on that?
No. So that's certainly possible. That's why we look at URLs that are shared by at least 20 people. So even if there is a conservative who is sharing content that they disagree with, there's a very high likelihood that there are also, 19 liberals who are sharing that content because they agree with it. So it's normal, actually, for URLs to have a mixture of people who are sharing the content, and it could happen, but it's not. We don't think it's a very frequent occurrence, as evidenced by when you aggregate this on the site level, the sites that look to be aligned with conservatives, just all those sanity checks we did, those seem to agree. No. Does anyone have a mic yet? I don't know. Yes?
Okay, very interesting. So you projected all the data in one line, right? So, and that's, of course, the first thing to be done. But I was wondering if you would try to embed the political opinions in a higher dimensional space. And if this exposure you obtain is not because of the projection, so do you think if you would consider other dimensions, would the exposure increase or decrease, the cross exposure?
Oh, so that's a very interesting question. So, yeah, and I think there's a bunch of research that supports that most people don't, even though they'll identify with liberals or conservatives, not all of their opinions exactly align with those. I would just have to guess that it would be more diverse, but definitely it would need further study. Something with topic modeling, actually identifying the topics of the things being discussed, and indeed, then you could look at how diverse the opinions are per topic or per dimension. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. I wonder if you look for the connection drops between liberals and conservatives in some specific periods of time. For example, if you aggregate these connections, how it is changed in temporal behavior. For example, I'm from Turkey, and during the Gezi events, most of the people, you don't know your friend's political opinion beforehand. Since after he or she shared some post, you notice this, and sometimes you are so angry about the post and you just drop the connection. I wonder whether if you analyze such kind of things. Thank you.
So we didn't in this study, but the Pew report on slide 2 did ask survey questions about exactly this for US, not for Turkey. Have you ever unfollowed someone or unfriended someone? Yes.
Well, okay. Yeah, thanks a lot. Very fascinating research. One thing, a next question related also to some of the questions asked could be what can we see or what can you infer from this data about the effects of these relations on how opinions change? There are different theories around. Some would say if you are exposed to content that is very different from your own position, that may actually make you be even more entrenched in your own position, and other theories would say it make you move more towards what you see in that content. So are you doing things in that direction, or are you interested to do it?
I think we're interested. I'm not sure we will. But I think what would be particularly interesting to study, so as far as I know, the studies so far, they've taken people who self-identify as liberal or conservative, and then they have them read articles that are either kind of aligned with their opinions or opposite to their opinions, and then ask them what they think now. And I think this is where oftentimes people will become even more entrenched in their original opinion when they are exposed to cross-cutting content. In this case, maybe it would turn out similarly if you look in online social networks, but I think the interesting thing is that here it's coming from a friend. So it's not you're just reading some article, it's your friend actually sharing that they agree with this, or maybe even more nuanced thoughts about the subject. So it might be a different kind of engagement. So it would be definitely interesting to study.
It's me. This is a cross-section.
Sorry, can you?
Yeah, I'm here in the back.
Oh, hi.
This is a cross-section, but the interesting question is, how does it change? How does a pattern change, and might be there a trend to polarization or so?
Okay, fortunately, we have data spanning over 2 years. We originally started the data analysis with the data from 2012, And then it took us a while to assemble the paper, and then a reviewer said, actually, they didn't ask for more up-to-date data, but they asked for understanding position effects, and the position effects were not in the data we had. And so Eitan actually went back and redid the entire analysis with really up-to-date data, and at least for this 2-year period, the results were just substantially the same. So it hasn't changed in the U.S. over this period. But I agree that it would be a very interesting thing to continue to look at.
Thank you for your talk. You began by saying this is US-centric. I don't know if you've got any idea. I know America is like the first approximation of the world, or maybe it's moving to China. But have you any idea how representative America is of the world?
Do you mean with respect to political engagement?
Your results in terms of the way people engage with cross-cutting views or not?
Unfortunately, no idea.
Thank you for the talk. The question I have is, with respect to US politics, it's much more issue-based. Do you observe any issue? Did you look at content type, for example? Ideological slant is one thing, but what about issues like abortion, gun rights, climate change, immigration, unemployment? Do you find any differences in how a particular genre of or issue-based content is changed, or that's not part of your analysis? Or?
So we didn't look at this at all. I think this relates to the earlier question. It would be an interesting next step to look at particular issues and more dimensions. I mean, this is just like the first step, really. We did the easy part, right, which is just not, our classification of URLs was aligned with liberals or aligned with conservatives. We'd have to do a bunch more to figure out, okay, is this a debate about this issue? And I think then it might be. I think with issues, right, there could be sub-arguments that go beyond, is this just aligned, is this something that liberals are sharing or conservatives are sharing? So I think it would be a fascinating analysis, but we didn't do any of that.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay.
Thanks a lot for this fascinating talk. The results are really encouraging, and we might not live in echo chambers after all. But then still you studied active users, and you studied users that self-reported their political affiliation. So is there something you can say about those users? Are they special in a way? Do they have very strong political views? How representative is this of the entire Facebook population?
Demographically, they look like the rest of the Facebook population. The reason why we selected active users is because they had some exposure to news. If you're not very active, then in a way it's a moot point because you're not on the site to be exposed to the content that we'd like to measure. I would only speculate, and the reason why it's difficult is because you could infer people's political affiliation from their friends, right? Most of the time, if you see someone surrounded by a lot of liberal friends, you could infer that they're liberal and be right, 80% of the time or something, depending on the distribution. However, now you can no longer measure the diversity of their network because you've used their network to infer their political affiliation. Similarly, you could try to infer their political affiliation from the content that they're sharing. However, then it's a similar problem, right? So, I mean, this really was a study of these users. We thought that they would be interesting to study because they're actually coming out and saying, this is my political affiliation, and so we want to see how much cross-cutting exposure they have. And I don't want to speculate what's true for the rest, but I think it would be interesting to study.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lada. Token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
So you have to. Okay, it is a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is one of the pioneers, one of the early users of agent-based modeling, and has gone on to use agent modeling and data to study opinion dynamics, and has published results in leading journals from PNAS to Annual Review. So, my great pleasure to introduce Andreas Flache.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for this very friendly introduction. We know each other for a long time, have worked together a lot, and that has always been a great pleasure. It's also my great pleasure to thank Santo and the other organizers, for putting this great conference together. And I'm honored to have the possibility to discuss with you here some of my work. I'm really looking forward to that. So I chose for this topic here the complexity of social integration in diverse society. Half of my identity is being a sociologist, which explains why I'm interested in social integration, because that's the topic sociologists study and are interested in. Broadly conceived, social integration is referring to the extent to which a society or a group of people holds together. That can mean many things. A little bit more precisely, it means, for example, the extent to which in a diverse group we still find consensus on certain important fundamental themes, norms, values, and so on. It also means the extent to which we find positive social ties like friendships, relationships of trust, cutting across the boundaries between different groups. So from that side, I think it's quite clear that studying social integration is particularly interesting and relevant when we talk about diverse societies, diverse in a cultural sense, in an ethnic sense, or in other senses. Well, the other half of my identity is being a computer scientist by training, so I'm very interested in looking at this topic from the perspective of computational sociology. And for this particular conference here, I thought it'd be interesting to reflect upon the role of big data and to what extent big data are a chance, and also to what extent this topic poses a challenge to big data. Now, I must say we have seen already great work going in this direction, and I'm happy to discuss a bit more my thoughts on this now. Well, this is a lousy graph, but it conveys a clear message. So based on data from the United Nations, we see for European countries in the last 2 or so decades, a clear increase of the proportion of the population that comes from other countries. There are a few notable exceptions, and for each of where we see a declining trend, and for each of these exceptions there's a story, but the overall trend is very clear upwards. in some countries more remarkable than in others, but in general we see an increase of a non-negligible magnitude. Now one could say, foreign population coming from other countries, that's just migration, labor migration, so why should that be a problem for diversity? But if we look at figures, for example, in the Netherlands, we have these figures, and of course in many other countries too, that look in particular at the proportion of this immigration coming from countries which can be classified as, let's say, being culturally different. In the Netherlands, they use the term non-Western minorities, which is a bit of a strange term, but okay. We see that this proportion is rising even more sharply. So from that perspective, one can wonder, what would this do to social integration? Does this pose challenges to integration? So here I have a very stylized representation of, one of the possible challenges, which is segregation. We have talked here already at this conference a lot about segregation. This is a picture from a school class that we studied. And admittedly, this is not ethnic segregation. This is segregation between boys and girls. But we have different results also for ethnic segregation in school classes. So segregation here means we have different groups and we have many social relations within those groups and only few social relations cutting across. Well, Lada Adamic was discussing this just for different political affiliations, and we see it also in the pattern of, for example, different ethnic groups or nationalities in various contexts. And to the extent that this segregation is there, we may be worried what it does to integration of a society. For example, from the perspective of a very prominent theory from social psychology, contact theory, it would be very important to have positive relations cutting across these group boundaries, because these relations may be needed to reduce prejudice and to may be needed to make people think more positively and openly about other groups. And if these relations are not there, then this process may not take place. And from that perspective, one can wonder whether this then may foster trends towards opinion polarization. Again, this is a stylized example taken from a computational model, but think of this as a two-dimensional opinion space in a society where we would say the one opinion dimension might be how tough the government should be in terms of immigration law, and the other dimension might be which share of social welfare benefits should go to immigrants. Here we would see in this stylized example perhaps an emerging dynamic where one group moves upwards on both dimensions and the other group moves downwards on both dimensions. And it's of course important to know, where does this go? Does it end up in a polarized state where one group is entirely here and the other entirely there? In which case we probably might be worried about the possibility of these groups to ever come together and find a consensus on things. So the question I ask myself is, where can computational sociology help here to get more of an insight into challenges to social integration? And I think there are two big questions with a number of sub-questions. And simply they are basically, where do we stand? What is the current state of the situation? How much segregation do we have? Where, in which contexts? How much polarization do we have? And the other one is, where do we go? How do things develop? Does it become stronger or weaker? Or in which context does it happen? And most importantly, what are the underlying mechanisms? Because we need to understand those before we can say anything useful about what might be the effects of policies that one could adopt. Well, one famous example of policies are, for example, desegregation policies that governments use to reduce segregation in schools or neighborhoods. But what the effects of these policies are may depend very much on what actually drives the segregation phenomenon. And there are very different possibilities which way it could go. So I think computational sociology can do a lot to help answer these questions, and I will right away say what I think is the main point I want to convey, that particularly for this type of question, we cannot give answers only based on data, however big the data are, but we need to combine this with computational modeling or theory-driven computational modeling, telling us what could be possible mechanisms and what could be the consequences of those mechanisms. But let's first have a look at a bit at what can data tell us about this question, where do we stand? And I would like to argue that we actually need both. And I call it here old data and new data, because I think small data and big data is not the right distinction. With old data, I mean things like government statistics, surveys, laboratory experiments, things that social scientists and many others do already for a long time. And new data are, data from online sources, social media, and so on. So the old data, and I call them old data because they can be sometimes quite big. The old data can tell us things like this. What is, for example, the spatial distribution of different ethnic groups in a city or across other forms of space? What is the distribution across schools, workplaces, associations? This helps us to see to what extent groups come together in the same context, are exposed to each other or not. We also can say something about trends towards polarization. In surveys, we can look at election outcomes, look how right-wing voting, for example, develops and in which context, in which local situations it emerges. We can also do experiments, for example, to get ideas about prejudice. Famously, we have the implicit association task experiments, which have told us a lot about prejudice that people have, even if they may not overtly show these prejudices, but they may be implicitly still there. So I think all these old data sources are still very useful and informative about this question of social integration. And let me just have with you a look at a few examples. So here I think we have a case of very big old data. So government data based on the US census. And in many countries we have similar data sources. Certainly I know it for the Netherlands. So these are data which allow us to go down to a geolocated unit of about 60 inhabitants and see what is the ethnic composition of this particular spatial unit. And here people from the demographics research group at the University of Virginia have then used what arguably is computational social science methods to put this on a map. And of course, a little bit of simulation is involved here, but not much. And here you see a map that we then get for the inner city of Chicago in 2010, telling us clearly something about the high level of ethnic segregation or racial segregation, as one says in the US, that we have here. And based on that, we can now compute, of course, also quantitative measures of segregation and see where the trend goes. And this is really big data because, well, you can do this for the whole country. And then we have really quite a bit of data points. And, well, we have similar things for other countries too. But also small old data can help us to get inside. Surveys, I mean, one important thing about surveys is that often we have control about the composition of the sample, and we can draw the sample in such a way that it's really representative of the population. So here just one example from a recent survey in the Netherlands. Well, this is small. It's only about 1,000 people, but we know that on many characteristics, this sample is representative of the Dutch population. And they were asked amongst many questions, also this question: do you generally think positively or negatively about Muslims in the Netherlands? And this question was asked at 2 different time points. It's not a panel for the social scientists. What we can see here is at least an indication that there may be a trend towards polarization, right? So we see the neutral group declining between these 2 time points, and we see those who think positively or very positively become more frequent. and the same goes for those who think negatively or very negatively. Of course, there may be many reasons for these trends, and we have to look further, but at least it gives us an indication what we may need to look for. But obviously, new data, big data, can help us a lot to fill in many gaps left by the old data. They can give us new knowledge, and I think it's particularly valuable when we combine that with what we know already from other data sources. Just the other day, Michael Macy was presenting here results from this great study, which, for example, tells us something to what extent we see in online communities segregation between different cultural groups. This actually refers to let's say a global, or in online interactions, this refers to a global network. But we can do this, and some people do this here, do this also more for local situations. For example, at this conference I have seen a poster by Daniel Alexandrov and Alexei Gorgatse, who did this for groups in groups from the Caucasus in Russia, and also there it's interesting to see how these segregation patterns there look like. We can also, and we have just seen a very impressive example of that in Lada's work, we can also look more into opinion processes, distributions of opinions, and interesting. And well, also how these change over time would of course be very important and interesting, and how this links to what we see offline. And I just give this one example I came across, which I found very interesting, from a website of Twitter, who have this survey service that tells, well, if you want to pay for that, that tells you where in the world people respond to certain events, in which way. Here this example from Obama's speech on Syria, and then it was tracked down where the Twitter activity then came up. And well, I think it would be very interesting to see, for example, if we have certain political events, speeches by, let's say, right-wing politicians, where and in which areas and activity would follow, and how that relates to, for example, the ethnic composition there. So I think we can learn a lot from new and old data about this question, where do we stand? And I think it's more difficult to answer the question, where do we go? How do things change and develop? So for example, questions like these: does segregation increase or decrease? Do we see more or less intergroup contact over time, and in which contexts and under what conditions? And how could we, if we wanted to, design policies that affect these phenomena? So my argument would be that in order to be able to answer these questions well, we really need more than just the data. We really need theoretical modeling, computational modeling, also telling us what are the important processes to look at, the important dynamics we need to understand, and the questions we need to ask. And well, I think there's a fundamental reason for that, and we have seen that also here in quite a few presentations at this conference. I think the reason is that basically every social phenomenon, also social integration in a diverse society, is a case of social complexity. Well, what does that mean? It's just what we know from complexity research in general. We look at a situation where we have many interdependent units, individuals, who interact with each other, which may create self-reinforcing processes. Think of opinion formation. If people may have maybe slightly prejudice and they interact with others, this may lead to an increase of their prejudice, and suddenly we may see much more at the collective level in terms of prejudice that people have than we would have expected from looking at their initial opinions in the first place. And often these relationships of social influence, for example, are nonlinear, which doesn't make it easier to understand what goes on. So often we see then unintended consequences. Famous examples from the social sciences are relating, for example, to segregation phenomena, where we see that even if people have only very mild preferences to not be outnumbered in their neighborhood, Schelling's famous work, this may translate into very strong segregation at the macro level. So just having the data on individual preferences alone would not tell us very much about the underlying reasons for segregation. So these unintended consequences may lead to really unexpected and also undesirable effects, and we better need to understand the underlying mechanism that are playing a role there. And that also translates, into complex relations between what happens at the macro level and what happens at the macro level. I already discussed this case of segregation. So if we see, for example, the ethnic heterogeneity of, let's say, a city or a population gradually increase, well, then we cannot be sure that, for example, the level of segregation increases linearly in the same way, but at some point there may be a tipping point, and we suddenly may see much more segregation than we would have expected just based on a projection of the trends we have seen so far. I want to illustrate this with some examples from the computational modeling work that we have done on modeling opinion polarization. Well, I call it here inter-ethnic opinion polarization, but what really in the modeling work we did is, of course, looking just at different groups and have no particular meaning attached to those groups. So think again of the stylized example. We have one group in this upper corner of the opinion space and the other one in this lower corner of the opinion space. So we see clear divisions between groups in terms of their opinions. And now we may ask ourselves, well, how could this come about? What is the underlying reason? And the example I want to discuss is one where we can show that there are at least two very different causal processes with very different implications. And let me go a bit over that. So a first possible process that we studied, and quite a few other people studied in a range of papers, is the interplay of what I call here positive and negative influence, and I will elaborate on what that means in a minute more. But a very different other process is what we call persuasive argument exchange, where people are exposed exposed to the arguments of others and change their opinions based on new arguments they receive, pro or con their current opinion. I will elaborate on that too in a minute. Let's have first a look at the first process, the interplay of positive and negative influence. Well, just to give you an idea, the influence part itself is modeled just based on, well, very classical social influence models, and we have seen quite a few of those here also in presentations. Basically, the idea is that if you have an opinion on a continuous opinion scale, and if you interact with somebody else, then if you are positively influenced, your opinion will move closer towards the opinion of the actor you interact with. But if you are negatively influenced, and your opinion may move away from the opinion of that other actor. And that is rooted in theories, for example, from social psychology, arguing that that may help to reduce your cognitive dissonance or to keep the balance in your relationships intact, basically conveying the idea that agreeing with your friends and disagreeing with your foes is cognitively a consistent thing. So Heide's famous social balance theory or cognitive dissonance theory underlying this. That is the one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that these weights, which decide whether the influence is positive or negative in an interaction, are themselves subject to a dynamic, where the dynamic here in the simple version of the model is just that to the extent that you are more different from each other, have a larger opinion distance, your weight goes from positive to negative. So once you have a negative, have large opinion discrepancies, you will negatively influence each other, further increasing these discrepancies. So we have a self-reinforcing process here. typically, and we and others have shown this in a number of papers, these models can generate a bipolarization under a large range of conditions. So you see here one example, a very simple one, where we start out with a uniformly distributed opinion on one dimension, and every line here is the trajectory of an individual changing his opinion over time. And as you see, sooner or later this falls apart into two groups, both ending up at the extreme ends of the opinion spectrum, but opposite ends. And here you see how the frequency distribution loads then only on these extreme ends in the end. So what happens here is that initially, at least a few individuals, in a few pairs of individuals, distances are large, so those negatively influence each other, move away from each other, but they are still positively connected to friends, and they pull their friends with them. And so, as a consequence, the group starts to fall apart here. And of course, this does not happen under all conditions, but under quite a few. This does not yet tell us a lot about diversity. So in other work, we added to this the element that similarity is not just based on opinion similarity or dissimilarity, but also on whether you're, for example, similar in terms of what we call here demographic features, group membership, maybe gender, whatever. So abstractly, this is just included in the computation of the similarity between actors, and now that can be used to study what effects would be, for example, of different distributions of groups across a space. Here, I will now go with you over a very simple example where we constructed a stylized case of spatial segregation, slightly extending upon a model I have worked on with Michael Macy some time ago to study effects of small world networks on polarization and dynamics. Here you see a case where we have perfect segregation, almost perfect segregation. We have these little caves, and they are entirely homogeneous in terms of the groups in the caves. So these are all black caves, these are all red caves. There's only one exception, the cave up here. And for the rest, it's a very simple situation we look at here. Well, why is there this exception? We start out from a randomly distributed opinion, and sorry, I added this exception because this is very instructive to see what the consequences are according to this model of mixing different groups in one context. So let me run. That's the one thing. The next thing we did was then, after some time, to add random ties to see what happens when we further reduce the segregation. So how will this change the distribution of opinions? Now let's run the model. So now we are at the point that no random ties have been added yet, and you have seen how, starting from this random initial distribution, basically in all these subgroups we have more or less moderate local consensi developed, with the one exception of that group up here, which polarized because these different groups interacted within this group, this small subgroup, and we saw this negative self-reinforcing dynamic come about in this group. And now we add the random ties. And these random ties now link groups which are different in terms of their group membership to each other, or caves to each other, and particularly they link this cave which has been polarized to the rest of the world, which, so to say, leads to the spreading of extremization, if you want, like an infectious disease that spreads through the network and ends up in a totally polarized state. So to summarize, this model would predict that segregation actually retains pluriformity, and if we reduce segregation, we would see polarization. Well, this is a counterintuitive prediction, and you don't have to think that it's necessarily true, but it's a theoretical prediction, and we have to think about what we can do about this. In another model, we looked at a very different process, and here the idea is that it's based on persuasive argument theory. Again, we have opinions, but this time they are constituted by arguments. So, for example, the number of pro versus con arguments that you hold for a certain opinion gives you your position on the opinion scale. Actors interact mainly or more likely with those who are more similar to them. And if you interact, you get arguments from the person you interact with. And this model has an interesting consequence, because if similar people interact, then this may increase polarization. This is just for an illustration here. So you have here this opinion scale, and you have here these two similar actors who interact. And if they interact, they are likely to get arguments from the other that already is more or less in line with their opinion, but may reinforce their opinion because they get new arguments supporting it. So they may both become more extreme, and the same goes for the other side of the opinion scale. So if we play this out for the effects of segregation, then in this case here you see that we have here a situation where we start out from two groups which in terms of their demographic features are arranged such that they are totally different from each other. No overlap between the groups, so arguably a segregated situation. They still can interact to some extent because they may be similar in their opinions, which are randomly given at the outset, but over time we see how gradually these two groups move apart and end up in a totally segregated and polarized state. Now, if we slightly reduce that initial segregation by adding just one actor who is overlapping with both groups, we see a very similar dynamic in the beginning. These groups move apart from each other, but in the end come together and are ending up in a polarized, in a consensus state. So we have two plausible models with opposite predictions, two strategies, and I think there are now two strategies that we need in such situation to get further and learn more about it. The first strategy is testing macro predictions, and for that we need data. We need to look at real segregation patterns, for example, at real opinion distributions, and try to fit and map the models to these situations. But that will not be enough, because we also, have to look at the micro level, at the micro assumptions that we assume here. And for that, we have computational modeling that pointed us to what we needed to look at. So do, for example, opinion distances increase or decrease as a function of the similarity between people? That's a question we can try to answer in lab experiments, both off and online. Just to give you a flavor of the first strategy, so think we have data about spatial distribution of ethnic groups. Here an example of Amsterdam, based on data from Statistics Netherlands. This can be translated into initial configurations for a simulation model. We have seen this, for example, in Alessandro Vespagnani's work, also on disease spreading. We can use that then to play out what, for that particular situation, would be the consequences of the one or the other opinion formation model. We did this here not for a real database simulation, but for a simulation where we used a Schelling segregation model to create a more realistic initial setting as compared to the highly stylized models we were looking at before. And let me just show you what happens if we run the model with positive and negative influence starting from this particular initial configuration. So what we see is, you have these areas of the one group, the orange crosses, and the shading shows you the opinion, with black being the one end and white the other end of the opinion spectrum. And you see that opinion differences, large opinion differences, arise at the places where groups meet, because there's the potential for these negative influence dynamics the highest. And on the whole, this suggests that if we have more segregation, we would have less polarization. With the other model, the dynamic looks a bit different. So we would see more something like this. Well, if there are at all tendencies towards polarization, then we would see them here and there more within the areas where we have homogeneity within groups, and not so much at the boundaries between groups. But in this model, there is not a strong tendency actually at all towards polarization. So if we map this out more systematically with many realizations, doing statistical tests and so on, roughly what we see is that the negative influence model predicts that as segregation goes up, we see more differences between actors and their outgroup neighbors whom they meet, but at the same time we see declining differences between actors and their in-group neighbors, and that adds up to less polarization overall. Whereas for the other model, we see a very different and less pronounced trend, and we will look into this, or have to look more closely into this. So, we also need to look into at the micro-level processes, and I will not go into this now in detail, but just point you to 2 studies that we did, inspired by this theoretical work. In one study, we tested this negative influence assumption, and as part of another study, we tested this persuasive argument model, both in a highly controlled experimental context. And just to give you a brief impression of at least one of these 2 studies, it seems that so far we could not find really support for this negative influence process. So here you see results from that experiment where we here have variation in the initial distance in opinions between agents or participants of that experiment. And here you see the opinion change following exposure to this other opinion. And this is a positive change towards the source, and overall we see much more change towards the source. And in particular, we do not see more negative influence when distance goes up. We see less of it. So at least if that model were the reality, we probably do not have to be that worried about polarization coming up very soon. Okay. So to summarize, I think to study social integration in a diverse society by means of computational social science, we can gain a lot from computational social science, but we can gain the most if you combine these 3 elements: theory-driven models, new big data, but also old, small, and big data, controlled experiments. And, well, let's face it, there are big challenges also involved here. For example, that there are very many different models that we have to deal with. So we have to carefully map out the implications of these possible models and translate them into tests in experimental designs and other forms of empirical tests. We are faced with privacy concerns. So suppose we get all this information about polarization breaking out in particular areas with particular ethnic compositions. Well, we want to be sure that this is not used against different groups in some way, so we have to be very transparent about what we are doing there. And maybe the biggest challenge, scientifically spoken, is that we always have this interplay of micro-level and macro-level processes, and that we really have to look carefully how these relate to each other. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, I wanted to have your comment maybe on an issue here on the difficulty of having causal and interesting models in the social sciences. I mean, we are heading to the end of the conference, so maybe some comments. I mean, overall, an impression that I had is that there is a segregation also between, I would say, first division and second division, if I want to be, a little bit provocative. People having big teams with lots of engineering and big data, let's say, and building systems, etc. And then people doing models without data, let's say, to be a little bit schematic. Mm-hmm. And of course, I mean, as you said in the last slide, the mixing the two is very important and challenging, and there are a few examples of that. Alessandro's Vespignani talk was one of these, but in that case, I would say models are very useful because human agency is quite channeled. I mean, you can't do much when you're infected. Okay, there is a biological side to that, and this helps, I think, building these models and being able to digest lots of data. Okay, so in that case, models, I think, are really useful, but when data is scarce and human agency is very complex, as in the segregation issues, I think that modeling is much more complex. So can you comment on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is a very important point. I tried to convey that it's very important to be aware of this complexity and that we cannot just simply think if we have a lot of data on, let's say, what goes on at the individual level about people's opinions, how they change, that we right away know what would happen at the societal level. So that makes that point, I think, even more urgent. At the same time, I think there's much work going on in trying to get a better understanding of what really are the microprocesses, how they relate to what happens when people interact. And my view would be that, well, as I expressed, that we really need both for example, the experimental work, the work with field data, surveys, the big data to target these questions at all levels, and these are always models to be seen in a theoretical sense. So they make theoretical predictions. They should be able to make predictions which in the end are refutable, but that's science. I mean, we will accumulate, and that's what we are doing also already for quite some time. We accumulate more and more information about hypotheses we have generated, tests we have conducted, both at the macro and the micro level. And hopefully that helps us to get a better understanding of these phenomena. I'm totally ready to admit that in the work about disease spreading, for example, people are much, much further than that. And it's maybe arguably an easier problem to target. But in my view, this does not say that we should totally give up on this. I think doing modeling work and combining it with data is much better than just verbal theorizing about this.
I have another question, sorry. I think I'm just curious, what do you think here? Hello? Hi.
Yeah.
I'm here, sorry. I was just wondering, what do you think is like the role, of online here? I mean, do you think there are the same mechanisms taking place if you look at online exposure to culturally diverse people than you have offline, or are there like any additional constraints which those models need to include?
Yeah, an excellent question. I would definitely not say right away these are the same mechanisms. I mean, there's also a question that is up for being studied more closely. I mean, there are a few good theoretical reasons to think it's not just the same. Online interaction often is, let's say, less costly in terms of the time you need to invest, maybe also in terms of the emotional restraints that you have to impose. There are studies, for example, of organizations showing that collaboration, cooperation in virtual teams can be a very different thing than in offline teams, partially, for example, because social control works in a very different way and may be less effective than in face-to-face relations. So I think this is also something that we need to understand better.
Yeah, I want to go back to the opinion formation model in relation to the spatial distribution of ethnic groups. Could you talk a little bit more about policy implications, and have you seen examples of how we can use computational social science and kind of results from these models to inform more effective policy interventions?
Yeah. Well, I think we are not there yet, that we really use these models combined to data to inform policy interventions. But interestingly, you see that policies are done and are conducted based on much more, let's say, intuitive ideas about how things work. I mean, I mentioned this desegregation policy, which we had in the 1960s, starting in the 1960s in the US, and we have it now in Europe in various places. And a sort of underlying intuition of this is that it is important for various reasons to bring different groups together, for example, in schools, but also in neighborhoods, because this may improve intergroup relations, reduce prejudice, reduce inequality in life chances, and all that. But this is not informed by this sort of modeling, where this sort of modeling, at this point at least, I think, reminds us that there may be quite a bit of unintended consequences of these policies, and we do actually see them, and there's a lot of discussion about these unintended consequences. But yeah, I think politicians need to be more aware of the potential of this sort of work to point to these consequences.
Okay, I think we are out of time, but I want to give you this, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you just, yeah. Yes, our final speaker is Peter Burnap from Cardiff University.
Okay, thank you very much. So thanks to Santo and everyone for inviting us and organising the conference. I'm well aware that I'm all that stands between you and coffee, so I'll try not to go over. So my name's Pete Burnap. I'm from the School of Computer Science and Informatics at Cardiff University. I'm going to be presenting today with my colleague Matt Williams, who is from the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University, and together we direct the Social Data Science Lab with obviously a strong interest in computational social science. So I've picked up a niggly cough on the plane, so I'm afraid you'll have to stick with me if I die halfway through. So we're going to talk to you today about Cosmos, which is our web observatory, and then we're going to give you an example of how we can use theoretically informed research design to answer social questions using Cosmos and big data, with a particular focus on human security analytics, which is where the majority of our research has focused to date. So Cosmos, as I say, is a web observatory. The motivation is to kind of democratize access to data and method. So in the social sciences, in the UK at least, I wouldn't really want to talk beyond that, there's not a huge amount of computational training, so you wouldn't be expected to be able to write scripts to collect data from the web, transform it in many different ways, pull data out of large data sets and so on. So Cosmos is designed to kind of democratize access to data and method to support the integration of social sciences with computational methods, so we can answer social questions from a theoretically driven perspective. But as one of the reviewers of our abstract also pointed out, Cosmos also allows other disciplines to join into the debate in computational social science, which is ultimately the aim, so we can bring other theories, other perspectives on the data. So essentially, we've got some screenshots up here to show you what's absent on this side is data sets, so a data set library. So it's made as a desktop application where you just drag and drop data sets. You can collect data from RSS or from Twitter or the web. It does all that for you. Or you can also bring your own data, CSVs, existing data, and so on. And the idea is it's all drag and drop. So you drag your data onto the middle section there, and then from the right-hand side, you've got a load of data transformation tools which you can then drag on top. So for example, you might drag a data set on, this is a Twitter data set, and then you drag a map onto it. It shows all the geolocated tweets. You can then reproduce that window and then drag a word cloud onto it. It'll give you a high-level topic overview. You could drag frequency chart onto it. That'll give you a perspective of keywords over time. So I guess one of the unique things of Cosmos is that it's not just a static display. You can then drill into the data and refine your data set. So for example, you've got the top level there, you've got day by day. Underneath that, you've got hour by hour, and beneath that, you've got minute by minute. So you can see particular spikes there. So if there's a spike of interest, there's clearly people are debating something or talking about something. You can actually click on that individual spike, drag that to the side, becomes a new data set, and then you can interrogate that. So that's the idea. So it's meant to be usable. It's developed with social scientists, for social scientists to be able to do computational social science research. It's also trying to contribute to some degree to reproducible research, citable research. The idea is this workflow could be exported into XML format, so you can share that and the data set with other researchers. They can import it in a Cosmos and reproduce what you've done, extend it, critique it, whatever you like, essentially. And as I say, it's also integrated. So there are obviously tools out there that'll do social network analysis. There are tools out there that'll do sentiment analysis, or you can plot things on a map. But Cosmos allows you to integrate all that and take data from a map into a network analysis, or a network analysis into a sentiment analysis. You can also analyze things like gender, occupation, and age. And ultimately, it's supposed to be open and plug and play. So on the right-hand side there, you've got a list of data transformation tools. The idea is you should be able to develop your own. So we're going to show you a machine classifier that we developed for cyber hate speech, which would fit in on the right-hand side. But if you're developing tools for community detection or topic detection, people should be able to develop their own tools, integrate them into Cosmos, and then other people can use them. So this is the ultimate idea. So, like I say, you can collect Twitter data, but we're also trying to bring in what Prof. Flache has just mentioned there with old data, if you like, so we can connect to the Office of National Statistics. In the UK, they have an API, so you can get data on populations, which you can integrate with maybe social media data or RSS feeds on blogs, whatever you like. So we can have kind of an augmented view of online and offline, perhaps communications, discussions, and of course explanatory factors. Again, all drag and drop. You can drag and drop an RSS feed from a web page into Cosmos, and it'll collect all the data for you to be able to analyze. But ultimately, it's web enabled, so you should be able to push and pull data sets, from wherever you like, and perhaps share data between web observatories. So there are a number of web observatories around the world, so you could share data between them. I won't go in too much into detail of the data transformation tools, so you can read them up there, but the one thing we have been working on a lot is demographics. So using things like Twitter metadata to establish gender, age, occupation, and to some degree social class through occupation, to give you a little bit more metadata about the online social media and the online social discussion and debate. But again, the key point is that we're trying to develop an API so you can bring in your own data transformation tools, such as supervised machine learning models. So as an example of how you might use this, we had a project funded recently in the UK, which was aiming to classify cyber hate, so hate speech directed towards social groups with protected characteristics, and looking in particular at how that spreads and propagates online, particularly following events. So part of that was develop a machine classifier. So we collected data from Twitter following the Woolwich terror attack, where a soldier was murdered on the streets of London and UK, and we collected tweets 2 weeks following that and had those human annotated with a simple binary question: is this offensive or hateful, antagonistic towards on the basis of religious or racial hatred? So we had a kind of a gold standard, if you like, human annotated gold standard following standard practice, and we aimed to machine classify that because the sample was rather large. We had over 500,000 tweets, and then look at how that propagated. We kind of expected that there would be a hateful reaction, and perhaps there would be particular groups in the UK that would propagate that. Where maybe would it go viral? Would it spread for a long period of time? So there are obviously keywords that you'd look for and you'd expect to see if you were analysing cyber hate, right? There would be particular key terms and phrases that would be obvious. But by looking at the small sample, we actually saw that there was a lot of calls for collective action and hateful incitement towards social groups. So phrases such as send them home, get them out, narratives around immigration and politics and foreign policy, war and immigration, and more extreme things like burn Qurans, should be hung. But these things, of course, be used in other contexts, so not necessarily hateful. So what we actually implemented the type dependencies linguistic parser from Stanford, which picks up on grammatical relationships between terms while also preserving word order. So it basically produces a kind of a triplet of a relationship and a subject and some governor over that subject. So if we take this kind of sample here, for example, send them all back home, this gets transformed and we get particular relationships then between the terms, such as them and home and send home. And what we did was we used those in addition to the obvious terms you'd expect to find, and essentially used those as an additional feature in a machine learning classifier. So if we look at kind of trying to frame that, I suppose linguistically these are kind of grammatical relationships, but sociologically we're looking at kind of othering terms, us and them, and differentiating between groups. And what we found is that significantly improved the results. So we used a variety of machine classifiers and essentially started with n-grams, so 1 to 5 words. We improved that by reducing the n-grams to statistically significant hateful terms. And we improved that again by the inclusion of type dependencies. It was improvement of around 7%. So in our sample of around 450,000, that would mean around 3,000 instances of cyber hate we would have missed without the type dependencies. So this shows that there is this othering term and inclusion of othering phrases actually has a significant improvement, which is very interesting. If you look at the overall performance between a Bayesian logistic regression or a decision tree or an SVM approach, there isn't really that much in terms of differential between classifiers, but the improvement with these features is quite significant. So essentially, once we've done this and we've built the model, if we imagine that integrated into Cosmos then as a transformation tool, we can then apply that to a larger data set, which will allow us to classify the tweets that we've collected around the event, and then conduct more theoretically driven experimental designs on how that might propagate. And Matt will take over and give you an insight into how we did that.
Thanks, Pete. I'm Matt Williams. I'm a criminologist from Cardiff University. I've got 3 minutes, so this is going to be a challenge. We all want coffee, I know, so I'll be quick. So basically, we took the machine classifications that Pete was talking about and entered them into 2 particular models that allowed us to, if you like, predict the propagation of cyber hate in terms of size and in terms of survival. So number of retweets, but also how long something was retweeted for on the 15-day analysis window. And we used Stan Cohen's notion of a moral panic and the theory around moral panics to actually visualize this data in terms of impact, inventory, and reaction. And we take social media then as in effect, a force amplifier for social reaction around deviant events of this nature. These are visualizations using the Cosmos platform. As you can see, geographic visualizations of where tweets emerged, in this case, within the first few hours following the event during this impact stage. The impact stage is characterized by confusion surrounding the event, essentially, as Cohen described. So no details of the perpetrator or the victim, only speculations regards to the motivation. Primarily, this came around from a YouTube video uploaded within 20 minutes of the attack of the assailant, discussing his motivations. Then we move on to the inventory stage, which is a much wider distribution of tweets across the country around centres of dense population, so London, Manchester, where Lee Rigby actually came from, the person who was murdered, Cardiff, Edinburgh, Newcastle, and so on, and in particular in Woolwich in London. But in this inventory stage, we get a more a specific focus on the perpetrator and the victim. So Lee Rigby, the perpetrator is mentioned, but also the occupation of Lee Rigby and so on. And then we have the reaction phase, which is essentially the last 3 days in the 15-day analysis window. And here Cohen describes how issues move on from the specifics about perpetrators and victims onto the wider issues. Why did this happen in the first place? How might we prevent it from happening in the future? So we have things relating to immigration, religion, and broader issues around security appearing in the word cloud there. On to the results of the specific models. To model size, we used zero-inflated negative binomial models because of the distribution of the dependent variable. What's key here for this presentation is that cyber hate did not propagate. It was certainly present in the sample of 500,000 tweets, but it wasn't retweeted at scale. It wasn't retweeted at scale. What was retweeted at scale following the event were tweets containing positive sentiment, so wishes for the family of Lee Rigby and so on. So they were significantly far more likely to be retweeted than negative tweets and tweets containing cyber hate. We also found that the media and police were far more likely to be retweeted in this particular period compared to other agents in the social media ecosystem. On to the Cox regression results. So the Cox regression results estimated hazards to survival. So how long did these information flows last in the 15-day analysis window? Two key findings here. On the left-hand side, we have Kaplan-Meier estimations for the survival of cyber hate. As you can see, extreme cyber hate died out within the first 24 hours, very, very rapidly. Then we have moderate cyber hate lasting up to about 36 hours, and then tweets containing no cyber hate actually lasting throughout the whole period. And on the other side of the slide there, we have Kaplan-Meier by type of agent. And what's interesting about this one here is that there's this battle between far-right political agents, such as the EDL, the English Defence League, and the BNP, the British National Party, combating with police information flows within the first 24 hours, 36 hours of the study window there. And I'll be quiet because everyone wants coffee. Please talk to us later if you want to have any more details, and these are the publications from which these results derive. Thank you.
So we have time for one question.
Make it a good one.
Kort eller svært, whichever. There's one there.
Does your system work with any languages other than English?
Essentially, not really at the moment. We've worked with English language at the moment.
We're trying to make it work with Welsh. We are from Wales, so we have a political reason to do that.
There's just not enough people in Wales that use Twitter to
Not many
analyse.
people in Wales, though. So.
I'm sorry, I may have misunderstood. Can you access any kind of online data? You provide the APIs or something? How does it?
So with online data, if there's a link to it where the endpoint can be kind of read by Cosmos, so RSS, or there's an API, then we can integrate that into the system. Or as I say, you can also then maybe download it and bring that in as well. So you can bring CSV files in, or essentially the transformation tools work with text. So
we're a bit over on time, so if you have other questions, please feel free to approach the speakers during the coffee break, and we'll reconvene at 11:05.